was 9 years old, I came home from school one afternoon to find my mom and my grandpa sitting together at the kitchen table. I could tell right away something was wrong. They told me they had bad news. My dad was missing. He and my Uncle Lee had gone on a weekend hunting trip. They were about half a mile into the woods east of Quetta when my dad realized he'd left his grunter back in his truck. A grunter is basically a hunting whistle that mimics the sound of a buck. Dad told Uncle Lee to stay put while he walked back to the truck to grab it. He never returned. Uncle Lee said he waited around 20 to 30 minutes before getting worried. When my dad still hadn't come back, he walked to the truck himself. Dad wasn't there. By nightfall, every deputy from the McDowell County Sheriff's Department was out in those hills searching. The effort went on for nearly 2 weeks. They never found a single trace of my father. Eventually, the sheriff called off the official search. My mom kept my dad's name on the missing persons list for years. The family pooled money to hire a private investigator, a retired police officer from Charleston, and a good one. But in the end, all he could tell us was the same thing the sheriff believed. The most likely explanation, according to them, was that my dad had wandered into a series of old abandoned mining pits near a town called Cucumber. The theory was that he fell down a mine shaft and his body had been lying there ever since. During the original search, caving specialists explored every mine shaft that could be entered safely. The unsafe tunnels were searched with trained cadaver dogs. No body was ever found. That didn't rule the theory out completely, but there was something the sheriff never mentioned. The private investigator later told my mom that there had been strange graffiti inside one of the mine tunnels. He didn't recognize the symbols or writing. It looked crudely sprayed halfway through the tunnel. He assumed it was the work of local teenagers and believed they might know something about my dad's disappearance. Despite his efforts, he was never able to find them. Uncle Lee stayed in close contact with the investigator and tried to help however he could. But my dad's disappearance hit him harder than anyone. Everyone told him it wasn't his fault. There was no way he could have known. Still, he was never the same afterward. I didn't learn the full story until much later. Between the day my dad disappeared and the day my mom finally had him declared legally deceased, there was a lot of hope and just as much heartbreak. My sister and I asking when Dad was coming home nearly broke her. As we grew older, we slowly accepted that he wasn't coming back. The pain dulled. It never disappeared, but it faded into the background of our lives. By the time I was 22, my sister had moved to Morgantown for college. I was working full-time at a repair shop in Welch. I hadn't seen Uncle Lee in 4 or 5 years. He sent birthday messages, holiday greetings, and occasionally called my mom around the anniversary of Dad's disappearance. But otherwise, he stayed distant. Then one day my mom told me Uncle Lee had called and wanted to talk to me. I was genuinely happy. I understood why he kept his distance. He once told my mom that I reminded him of my dad. Those memories brought both joy and pain. I assumed I wouldn't see much of him again, so when he asked to meet, I jumped at the chance. I drove out to his place near Filbert one Saturday afternoon. What followed felt like a 2-person family reunion. We were both relieved to see each other. He looked healthy, clear-headed. We shared cold cuts, snacks, and a beer while catching up. Eventually, the conversation drifted toward my dad. We talked about memories, things he used to do, how much we missed him. Then Uncle Lee made a suggestion. He asked if I wanted to visit the place where my dad disappeared. He said returning to those woods had helped him cope over the years. At first, the idea sounded unbearable. Walking through the place where my dad vanished felt like emotional torture. But over time, nearly a year of visiting Uncle Lee every few weeks, I came around. I told myself that if it became too much, we could always turn back. We planned the trip for a Saturday morning in early May. We treated it like a normal hike. We brought beer and food and agreed we'd only talk about Dad if it felt right. As we walked through the woods east of Quetta, I realized they weren't haunted like I'd always imagined. Mostly. But there was still something there. Some lingering presence, hope, memory. We reached Big Creek and stopped to rest. I suggested heading back, but Uncle Lee said there was something he wanted to show me. After another mile, we reached a rocky outcrop overlooking the abandoned mines. He admitted something he'd never told my mom or me. The last time he'd seen my dad was when he watched him walk into one of the mine shafts. He'd searched the woods calling his name before alerting authorities. When he stood on that outcrop, he saw a distant figure dressed exactly like my dad entering one of the tunnels. Uncle Lee ran down to the shaft with a flashlight, but no one was there. He said the mine made him uneasy. That thought haunted him for years, the idea that my dad heard him calling and chose not to answer, or worse, that something happened inside that mine that made him unable to respond. Then Uncle Lee asked if I wanted to go down to the mine with him. I agreed. The closer we got, the heavier the air felt. The entrance looked like a jagged wound in the rock. Inside were broken beams, abandoned tools, a cracked lantern, frayed rope, like the place had been deserted in a hurry. When I stepped inside, the cold hit immediately. I used a small keychain flashlight. The tunnel swallowed light. I turned back and saw Uncle Lee standing near the gate. He was holding a gun. Before I could react, he raised it. I ran. Gunshots echoed behind me. I turned off my flashlight and plunged into darkness. I ran blindly until the tunnel split. I chose a path at random and hid in a side chamber. That's when he started calling out. He didn't call my name. He called my dad's. Stanley. That was my father's name. Then something else moved in the mine. A rush of hot air came through the tunnel. It smelled wrong, like burning death. Uncle Lee started screaming. "He's here. I brought him. I did what you asked." Then Lee screamed in pain. I ran. I never looked back. The sheriff later said it was a gas blowout. Toxic gases, disorientation. I don't believe that. Something is still down there, and it should be left alone. My name is Mira, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher at UNC Chapel Hill's Department of Anthropology. My research focuses on the intersection of cultural practices and social identity, with an emphasis on ethnographic methodologies and historical contextualization. Or in plain English, I study how people's traditions and sense of belonging connect by watching them closely and looking at their past. I've undertaken a lot of interesting projects in my time, and while most have been both enriching and satisfying, there's one that I frankly wish I could forget. And that's not down to the subject matter, nor the people that I dealt with, as I cannot speak too highly of either, but rather a very particular encounter with a very particular woman. While researching the kinship networks, ritual traditions, and socio-cultural resilience of the Melungeon Appalachians, to cut a very, very long story short, the Melungeons are a mixed-race people who inhabit the area where Tennessee, Virginia, and North Carolina intersect. They're believed to have a blend of European, African, and Native American ancestries, with origins tracing back to the late 18th century or earlier. The term Melungeon comes from the French word mélange, meaning mixture, and was applied to those who lived in relative isolation in areas like Hawkins and Hancock counties in Tennessee, Lee County in Virginia, and parts of western North Carolina. The exact origins of the Melungeons remain hotly debated, with theories ranging from shipwrecked Portuguese sailors or lost colony survivors to unions between free peoples of color, European settlers, and indigenous groups like the Cherokee or Saponi Native Americans. Genetic studies, such as those from the Journal of Genetic Genealogy, suggest many Melungeons have roots in sub-Saharan Africa and northern Europe, possibly from early colonial interactions before strict racial laws had been established. Physical traits like dark hair, light eyes, and the so-called Melungeon bump on the head have been observed by researchers, though appearances are known to vary widely over time. Many Melungeons have assimilated into broader populations, but these days, it's common for their descendants to embrace their ancestry through groups like the Melungeon Heritage Association, who celebrate a complex identity that challenges what has traditionally been rigid racial categories. Undertaking research into the Melungeon seemed like an incredible opportunity, and in anthropology, it's rare to get one like that doesn't come with a 14-hour flight and a phrase book. I was overjoyed to receive the news that my proposal had been accepted. But if I'd known what I was going to encounter, there's no way in hell I'd ever have honored it. This is why. I remember driving along this winding Appalachian road, my old sedan rattling over the gravel as I wondered if the old girl was finally going to give up before I made it to my destination. The latest thread I had pulled led me to a village called Hollow Ridge, a place that, depending on which source you studied, wasn't even on the map. Some accounts made the rather incredible claim that the town's population manifested an atypical aging process, one that bent the rules of physiological expectations. Or to phrase it like the nice lady at the diner I stopped at said, all that good mountain air means folks out there live a heck of a long time. My notebooks were full of dead ends, so I figured there was no harm in chasing that one too. After hours of driving, Hollow Ridge finally came into view. Clapboard houses sagged against the hillside, smoke curled from chimneys, and a few folks lingered on porches, watching me roll in. I parked near a general store, grabbed my bag, and stepped out to breathe air that smelled of damp earth and pine oil. A man in overalls nodded at me from across the street. I nodded back and headed inside the store. The clerk, a wiry guy with graying hair, eyed me with suspicion when I started asking questions about the village. I told him I was a genealogist tracking Melungeon bloodlines. He frowned, gave me another look of mistrust, and then pointed me toward a dirt path leading up the ridge. Folks up there don't take to outsiders, he said. Better mind yourself. I thanked him, bought a Coke and a pack of gum, and started walking toward the ridge. The path climbed steep and cut through thick woods. My boots crunched on leaves and twigs. After maybe a mile or so, I came to a cluster of houses, smaller and older than the ones below. A woman sat on a porch shelling peas. She looked up, her eyes dark and steady, as I introduced myself and said I was researching family histories. She didn't smile. She just jerked her head toward the house behind her. "Mama's inside," she told me. "She's the one you want to talk to." I stepped up onto the porch. The door creaked open before I could knock. Two men stood there, both tall, with weathered skin and white hair. They looked like brothers. They didn't invite me in, and they didn't ask me what I wanted. They just stared until I took the initiative and explained why I was there. I kept it simple. The slightly shorter man, who had a scar across his cheek, told me, "Mama's 112. She don't talk much. Don't tire her out." The other nodded. Then they stepped aside and beckoned me inside. The house smelled of mildew and wood smoke. The living room was dim, lit by a single electric lamp in the corner. Lying in a bed was a woman, or at least what was left of one. When I say she was skeletal, I mean that in the very literal sense. Her skin was stretched so tight over her bones that it looked like the slightest touch would draw blood. Her eyes were sunk deep in their sockets, making her look ghostly. Her hair hung in thin white strands. Her hands rested like claws by her sides. Her breathing sounded like her windpipe was lined with sandpaper. I'd seen elderly people before. She was something else. I sat down on a stool one of her sons dragged over for me. She showed no reaction to my presence. Not a look. Not a word. Nothing. I started easy, asking her name. No response. One of her sons whispered from behind me, "Onita." I asked where her people came from. No answer. Her gaze remained locked on the middle distance, unblinking. I asked about her parents, her childhood, still nothing. Her sons hovered nearby, arms crossed, watching. "She's weak," one of them eventually said. "Don't push her." I told them I understood, but my curiosity burned. A 112-year-old woman who looked like she'd been starving for decades. I had to know more. I leaned forward, kept my voice soft. "Ma'am," I asked, "how long have you lived for, and how have you lived so long? What's your secret?" For the first time, she seemed to latch onto a word. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted. She turned to me with a look of pure fear on her face. And then, in a faint, raspy whisper, barely above silence, she said, "It eats the years." The strain of forcing out the words looked like it was killing her. When she finished, her eyes rolled back. Her body jerked weakly as she began to gasp for air. Her sons rushed over, one yelling at me to get out, while the other tended to his mother. I grabbed my bag and stumbled outside, heart hammering, as the door slammed behind me. As I walked back down the ridgeline, the old woman's words echoed around my skull. "It eats the years." What in the world did she mean? I wanted to go back. I wanted that more than anything, to demand answers. But I knew better than to outstay my welcome in such an isolated place. The woman with the peas was gone. Her bowl lay abandoned. As I started down the path, one of the son's cries of "Don't come back" still rang in my ears. When I got back to my car, I sat for a while, scribbling down every detail I could. The village felt different now, quieter, heavier. As I drove off, I found myself checking my rearview mirror far more often than usual. That night in my apartment, I replayed the day over and over in my head. Onita's face wouldn't leave me, neither would her words. When I finally slept, I had the most vivid nightmare. It was me lying in that bed more than a century old, croaking the words, "It eats the years," into the face of some terrified young researcher. The next morning, I called a research fellow, a folklorist friend, who'd written entire studies on Appalachian myths and legends. I told him about Hollow Ridge, about Onita, about what she'd said. He went quiet for a few seconds. Then he cleared his throat and said he'd heard rumors of a village fitting that description. He'd never been able to confirm them, just old folk tales about pacts with the land. He said such a find might be a great source of pride for me, and that he was excited to read my paper. After I hung up, I felt even more unsettled. As the days passed, I couldn't think about anything else. So a week later, I drove back. I parked and walked the path again. But when I reached the village, no one was on the porches. The houses were empty. When I reached Onita's home and knocked, there was no answer. The door was unlocked. I pushed it open. The living room was empty. No lamp, no bed, no Onita. I checked the other rooms. Nothing, no furniture, no signs of life. Outside, I called out. Silence. It was like the entire village had vanished. Weeks passed, I avoided my research, but the question gnawed at me. What did she mean by it eats the years? I dug through books, archives, and folklore. Finally, in an old journal scan from the 1700s, I found a fur trapper's account of a place called Hungry Hollow. The description matched Hollow Ridge. He wrote that the land had an unnatural temperament, and that he would never return no matter the cost. That encounter never made it into my paper. I tried to forget, but I can't. Because the fear I saw in Onita's eyes wasn't confusion, it was belief, and I am in no hurry to encounter it again. If you enjoyed listening to this story, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. More stories are coming soon,